Great. Okay, hello everybody. Lovely to see you. Or not see you as the case may be, which is absolutely fine. Recording is on, so if you don't want to come on screen, that's absolutely fine. If you do, that's also fine. And if you've got any questions as we go through the evening, put them in the chat and Fran will wrap them up for us. And if we can't answer them tonight, then we'll come back to you with some answers on that. So, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Lorraine Smythe, and my colleague Fran is here helping with me with this evening. And Josie's here as well, but Josie's here as a person rather than as an act person. So there you go, just a mix of us. I've got a series of slides for you. You won't be surprised to hear. So I'm going to share now and then talk you through the slides and talk you through what we're going to do this evening. Can you all see those slides? Yep, good-o. Right, so we're here today to talk about the Rural Survey summary. As I said, I'm Lorraine and my colleague Fran is here with me. And I'm going to get these slides to move. They are going to move. They are. So all of you know who Action with Communities is, I think. I think you've all been, I recognise most people on the call. But it's really good for us to keep reminding you that we champion community and rural issues. And our vision is that no one should be disadvantaged by where they live. So that's quite a challenge in Cumbria, but we're up for it. And part of this conversation is about how we help people to put across messages about the challenges they face about where they live. So we support communities to plan for their future through community plans, emergency plans, project plans. We help people to develop and sustain their projects in their communities. We help them to work with others and we help them influence policy change. So those are all things we do in order to help people not be disadvantaged by where they live. I think I need to say to you that tonight is not about answers, it's about discussion. So I am going to share with you the results of the survey, but the survey is one stage in a three-stage process. So I don't want you to go away thinking, oh, here's the answer to rural issues, because it really, really isn't. It's very much about having a discussion and thinking about things as we go forwards. Oops, come back. So the reason we did this was that we wanted to hear and enhance community voice. So the purpose of our project in doing this survey and the other two stages is to hear people speak about their place and the issues that they experience in their place. And this is a three-stage process. We started with an online survey just before Christmas. It finished in January, and now we're moving into focus groups. This is the presentation of the survey, but then we're moving into focus groups. So if you'd like a focus group with one of your groups, let us know. We can probably come and do that, certainly online, and a couple of them face-to-face as well. And we're hoping to move towards campaign materials. So material that helps us run campaigns on rural issues for Cumbrians. But here's an indication of the spread of responses. Not everybody gave us postcodes, but you can see that there's really quite a wide spread of people who responded. We had 174 responses, which I'll go into shortly, but there's a really good spread. I'm not surprised by the numbers around Penrith area. We get really good support around there. And there's pretty good support around Ulverston and Grange, which is interesting. And some interesting responses from the West Coast as well. So quite a broad spread of people. And as I said earlier, we will be sending out the slides after the event, so you will be able to see the slides. So this is just an indication of the spread of responses. One of the things we want to discuss tonight and in the focus groups is who else we need to speak to, because I'm absolutely sure that these responses will be from ACT supporters, people who know ACT and are involved in our work. And there may be quite a few ranges of other people, younger people, maybe some older people who don't do IT, that we also need to speak to. So it'd be interesting to have that conversation with you later. So the results from the survey so far, we had 174 responses from a very broad range of people. broad range of geographies, I guess, is the thing. And the thing to note on this slide, while people said that transport is a problem, they said rural affordable housing is a problem, they said poverty was a problem, but there were 134 comments on solutions, on things that people were doing in communities to make a difference to some of these issues. Now, we've got some more analysis to do on that, and we will be sharing that later. But at the moment, it's just really positive to note that people are thinking about how they can make a difference in their community, and that's a very positive thing to find out. We particularly and very deliberately use the term poverty. It's a very loaded word, but we decided to use it to see what people came up with in their responses. And we want to have some discussion about that in the focus groups, about what people think about what poverty means to them in a rural context. So that's interesting to think about as well. We want to keep, when we get to campaigning, we want to keep the messages positive. It's really important that we're not just going out saying, it's all wrong, then this, just make it better, because that's just not a reality. So having those positive comments about things that people think can make a difference is really important to us. Okay, other issues that people raised, because we asked them about other issues as well, were loneliness and isolation, which wasn't a surprise, access to health and GP services, ongoing issues, access to other services like schools, shops, such like. Local environmental concerns, we've seen that before. This is the first time I've seen in a generic survey, sustainability and reducing carbon. So people were actually raising those issues themselves. And I think that's very interesting to reflect. And it gave me a little bit of heart, really, to think that maybe the message that we need to be looking after our world in carbon sense and sustainability sense is getting through, that people are actually raising it in this kind of generic survey. Okay. Okay, so on to some of the transport responses. So we went out asking about 3 specific issues: transport, housing, and poverty. And we got responses about those other issues as well, because we asked them what else was important to them. But the sorts of responses we got under transport will be no surprise to anybody who's had anything to do with transport, using it or talking about it. A lot of people saying they don't have a service. End of. There is no service. So, affordable or accessible transport is just not an issue for them. Some frequency and unreliability, but the £3 bus fare is helpful. People were reflecting on the £3 bus fare, not just the £2 bus fare. So people are still appreciating that the £2 bus fare works. And a lot of rural responses about how volunteer and community support is vital. That's how people get around in their communities, using community and volunteer support. So that's really interesting and worthwhile noting. Also really good to hear that people thought the services were improving in some places. If you think about the geographic spread of our responses, the work that Cumberland and Westmoreland are doing on improving services is obviously having an effect. People are seeing it, which is really good. But also the very, very obvious things that people come back with about there's no footpaths. So we can talk about active travel till we're blue in the face, but who walks down a dark rural road with no footpath of an evening? So that's challenging. And the active travel is difficult on rural roads where people can speed to some extent. And I thought the no taxis locally was interesting. So people who might have got around if they lived in an urban area with taxis, it's harder to do that in a rural area. And that's interesting to reflect on as well. People were also very good at linking the housing and poverty and transport issues. So there was some complex thinking going on about how these things all link together. We've got a series of quotes from people, because remember what I said about we want to hear community voices. We want to hear from people. So I'm just going to read these out for you. So travel for work is unreliable and expensive. Lack of service makes the cost of living rise higher. You have to have a car, cheap car, to survive. Less populated areas often have infrequent or non-existent public transport options, leading to isolation and reinforcing the dependence on private vehicles. And these are direct quotes from people's responses. Public transport is non-existent. Luckily, I have a car, so don't depend on it. No buses at all in the winter. Summer buses are delayed or cancelled because of tourism-related traffic problems. It would be impossible to rely on public transport where I live. And of course, I've chosen these quotes, but these are indicative of the sorts of things people have said. So pretty much they're saying if you're rural, public transport's a bit of a challenge because it's not very well. There's not a lot of it around, and it's not easy to use, and you can't rely on it. Responses. Not so many, not surprising. People felt that local housing was unaffordable on local wages, and the real challenges with Airbnbs. And I thought the reflection that changes in government policy and market-led bills don't meet local needs was very interesting, because we hear that a lot from communities, that the market-led builds that are being done are just not meeting communities' needs. There's small rural communities that are already there, and there is a growth agenda, obviously, but that's interesting. Been a lot of conversations we're having with communities increasingly now about the need for properties to downsize to. So people want to stay in their community. They would quite like care in their community if that was possible, and that they'd quite like to release their properties for larger families to move into that community. If you think about community sustainability, that's really important. And of course, the lack of permanent residents threatening the viability of local services. Both things like schools and shops, churches, community buildings, a whole range of services are threatened by the lack of permanent residents. Increasingly a demand for properties to rent. Now here's a question. One person said this, but I thought it was quite telling. Beautiful places cost a lot to live in. That's life. How many of you think that's true? Put your hand up if you think that's true. I can't see you all, so Fran, you'll have to give me a reflection on that. Do you think beautiful places cost a lot to live in and that's life? Put your hand up if you do. What are we getting, Fran?
I can only see your screen, Lorraine, so I can't see what they're saying either. So
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, that didn't work then, did it? Trying to get some audience participation. Not working there. Okay, I might ask you that question later. So on the housing quotes, again, I'll read them to you. Youngsters have no chance of accessing the market. More rural housing needs to be protected by local occupation rules, and properties bought to let should be offered on a long-term let basis. As a local employer, it's difficult to employ staff that live locally. Too many holiday homes and Airbnbs. Not enough affordable housing for the people who work in the valley. The issue is not just about affordability, but availability. Right to buy has had a big effect. And holiday homes are necessary but need controlling and curtailing. So some quite thoughtful responses there about the housing issues. So moving on to the poverty responses. We didn't define poverty quite deliberately. We wanted to understand what people thought was going on there. And it's really interesting to see that 66 of the respondents didn't know if poverty is a problem locally, but 37 said not. And so when we do our focus groups, we're going to ask people about what they think poverty looks like. Some of the quotes will indicate to you what people think about it. So there were 75 of our 175 of our 174 responses who thought that poverty was an issue in their area. There's also an understanding of the linked issues with housing and transport, which we've seen in both the other issues as well. So the affordable and accessible transport and affordable and local housing and poverty are linked. The heating costs, that's been a big issue that we've all seen in the press, so it's not surprising to see that come up. But there were quite a few comments about poverty being evident in schools and how schools were having to deal with poverty, children not having breakfast before they come to school, children not having the uniform they need, children living in temporary accommodation so they weren't able to do their homework, children who don't have access to the internet. so they can't do their homework or engage in out of school activities in that way. So some interesting comments about those sorts of things as well. Again, the quotes. I'm shocked how many in my area need to access the food bank. I think paid workers rather than unemployed people. Everyone should have enough money to eat. Living rurally means I must travel more for work, food, shopping, socialising and such like, along with high rents and living costs. Pride and shame contribute massively to these people not seeking help for their crises. In the agricultural community, I see people who have years with negative incomes. Digital inequality, I know people who cannot afford to have broadband. There are lots of stoic pensioners in our community struggling to keep warm. So I think that that understanding that people are seeing that, are they seeing it or are they responding to press? What are people seeing in their community around poverty that makes a difference, that makes them think that there is an issue around that? So that's a quick summary of the results. We want to discuss the results with you. We want to discuss the results with other people because we want to understand them and dig into them more. We do have more data to dig into as well. We want to keep it positive, so we want to discuss solutions and options. And we want to then move on to campaigns to share the information and to share community voices on these issues. So, stop sharing for a moment, and then I'll be able to see you all. That's good, thank you. Lovely. So I'm going to ask that question again. How are we doing on numbers now? We've got 22. We're expecting 50 people this evening, so 22 is interesting, but there we go. So who of you think that it is expensive to live in a beautiful place and that's just life? Put your hand up, either your real hand or your virtual hand, and tell me whether you think that's actually true. Seeing many hands. Benita, on one hand, yeah? Not beautiful places can cost a lot to live in too. Yes, yes, that's true, Sandra. That is true. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So that was a quick run through of the survey results. I'm going to put you into working groups and I'm going to give you a document that you can download that's got a summary of the results on it and all the quotes. So you can have a look at those in your working groups. But just before we go into that, any quick questions? Anybody got any questions about any of the detail before you go into working groups? No? Everybody all right? And as I said to you at the beginning, the important part of this is you guys talking to each other about how we move these issues on. I did a presentation of these slides to my board the other week, and their reflection was that these are enduring, challenging problems. We're not going to find the solution tonight or in any of our discussions, but by carrying on talking about them, we just move the issue forward, hopefully, and help people to think about positive ways to make a difference. Somebody else from another group offer to speak, please.
I can.
Go for Alistair. Oh, Alistair and then Neil.
Yeah, okay. I think we're the same group.
Well, we're in the same group, actually. So
Yeah.
it was me, Neil, and Becky were in a group with interests in transport, housing, and youth. How are we going to do this? Shall I just keep going and everyone chucks in?
Sure.
I think first question, anything surprising? Would it be fair to say depressingly no, in that it was gloriously predictable? But perhaps the flip side of that is we wonder whether there's quite a lot of issues that weren't picked up by the survey, and therefore it rather questions, is it getting out to all of the voices, especially youth voices? So Becky, I don't know if you want to say anything, but Becky was making the point that surveys of young people, issues such as mental health, social isolation, addictions, and all the rest of it, they all come up. Now, they might be sitting behind Lorraine, you're nodding your head within the data, but as headlines from young people, you might have got there might be a rather different set of things being emphasized in that. So the surprising nature was what perhaps wasn't coming through in it. Our campaigns, I wrote down 4. Neil, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, campaigns for concerning rural transport, and the fact that a lot of our rural transport, of course, is used by tourists rather than for locals, and maybe we need to get the focus back that the rural transport should be for local folk. We have an artificially deflated rural population due to the costs of living and the difficulties of transport. Surveys in the Highlands and Islands from the past have shown that people deal with the lack of public transport by cadging lifts with others. And I think it was as many as half of the people surveyed said they travelled by asking friends if they can take them into town or what have you.
And I think, Chris, I think your point, which was don't forget the rural. I think from a transport point of view, the way that things are costed generally are on bangs per buck in terms of bums on seats. How many of those 3-word statements can I stick into one sentence? If that is the case, then rural areas quite often miss out quite a lot. But if quite a lot of the burden on transport because of deflated resident population is the visitor population, we need to be able to take account of the fact that there's an awful lot of people using the transport, but half of them aren't being counted. And so therefore we don't have the right volumes of transport for the populations locally. Now, I know it sounds a bit arcane, but it becomes quite important.
I'm going to butt in there and say, if only we had a bus service that was overrun by tourists.
Oh
it'd be
yeah,
fantastic. We don't have a bus service.
Indeed.
There was another point made, wasn't there, Alistair, about, for example, the 555 service, which runs all the way to Keswick. It's a long service, and the lack of public toilets is an issue preventing people using some services, particularly young parents with children and the elderly who do need regular stops for comfort purposes. And that is maybe an issue that we haven't really thought about before.
Lose for a campaign. So we kind of come up with housing, and especially affordable housing, which isn't just necessarily building housing, it's everything else that is. There's quite a lot of housing there, so how do we make it affordable for people to use it rather than just seeing it as lost to the what's it and second home levies and all the rest. Sorry, Neil.
Yeah, sorry, Alice. I was going to say the other thing is there are a lot of empty properties, some of which have been empty for a long while. Can we actually access those for affordable housing? Is it possible to look at purchase for that, even compulsory purchase in some cases?
And the ring fencing of second home levies, which are coming in as well, that would be a good campaign. And I'm sure this is all being discussed. Our third, just to go through our list, because I'm aware of time, is the youth voice, the youth rural voice. And what is that voice? What are those issues? How can they be used more effectively? And I don't understand because I can't even spell social media, so don't start me on it. And finally, and this is my little hobby horse, is it's not just buses. It's kind of like there's a huge colourful array of potential, well, I'll call them transport solutions, but they're solutions that allow people to access things that quite often don't get talked about because a lot of people aren't aware of what the potential might be. So there's some campaign about, oh, and by the way, there's all these other ways of getting around that I just think we need to talk about more. And I know, Lorraine, you're nodding because I bored you to death with this for about the last 20 years, but I just think, some of the solutions or some of the stuff you were presenting earlier, which is, the £3 bus fares being great. It's all about buses, and buses are really important, but there's so many other ways of getting around. And if I had a campaign, it would be something about just building froth around these other options.
That's great. Thank you. Two very quick points. Becky, we want to talk to you about youth voice. It's really important that we do that. And we want to go to the Cumbria Young Farmers and put the survey out amongst them. So there are targeted groups that we're going to go to and have the conversation with. So that is really important. And the second point to make was somebody was saying that if we had the funding for bus services for visitors, we'd be all right. Same goes for our medical services. We have the funding for our medical services for the population, and that population grows by millions in the summer. and there's no additional funding comes into that service. So there are real disadvantages for rural areas that we need to address and think about. Kate, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to volunteer to go next if everyone's finished, because we were group 3 and this is the third.
Go for it. Thank you, Kate.
Basically, I think there was no surprises about the results. We were all just like, well, yeah, we all knew that already because we all live here. So, you know, I don't think there were many surprises. Campaign messaging, I think there was a couple of things. I'll go first on the housing. Basically, the unbalanced housing system in Cumbria, and particularly in the Lake District, is a major issue. And there's some figures from a Generation Rent survey, which says that in 2023, Copeland had 426 new houses built in 3 years up to 2023. And in those 3 years, 407 existing homes went to the second holiday or holiday let and arena. So essentially, you've got 19 new homes for local people. So the thing is that you are never, ever going to be able to meet demand for new houses in Cumbria and the Lake District just because it's a beautiful place. And it should, you know, as was said earlier, should we be penalised for wanting to live in a beautiful place as a resident who was living and working here? And personally, I'd say no. But essentially, demand is different from need. And need is most important because need is actually the need of people who live in local communities who are unhoused or poorly housed or living on floors or whatever. So the problem is that the current setup basically favours developers building large houses. You know, like Kendall's about to get another 192 houses, half of which are going to be 4 and 5 bedrooms, which is just like, well, who's going to afford to buy them? You know, nobody in Kendall's going to be able to afford to buy 4 or 5 bedroom house. It's going to be people coming from outside, so it's not going to solve the needs of the community. And I know that, you know, government has legislation that says you can't have, you know, like you have to have so much social housing, but you're never going to get any more than that because, you know, housing companies aren't going to build any more than that. So essentially my idea for a campaign is that we basically need to go hard on the second homes. The other figure I'll give you is, I don't know how many of you know Karen Lloyd, who is she's a local academic and very interested in nature, but she also has a very big interest in the Lake District. She posted something on Facebook last night. There are 14,000 Airbnbs in Cumbria. 14,000. That is 14,000 homes that are not for Cumbrian people. So we're in a situation where people are being forced out of homes and, you know, like other people are coming in for holidays. And, you know, yes, the tourist industry is very important, but not at the expense of people being able to be housed and have good lives. So that then brings us on to the other part of the thing, and this wasn't brought up by me, this was brought up by Benita. Benita said, have you read that report by Friends of the Lake District, Who Pays for the Lake District? And I'm like, yeah, I partly wrote that. So basically Benita is keen to actually see a visitor levy, like a bed tax or something, put on tourists to actually start solving some of these issues around social housing and around transport. So it is one way of actually building a bunch of finance, building a bunch of money that can actually be used to solve some of these problems, to solve the issue of 320,000 people in the Windermere catchment on a sunny day, which basically means they're all going to the toilet and it's all going straight into Windermere because the sewage system can't cope. So we're in a situation where you've got an invisible burden of tourism, and it doesn't just sit in the Lake District, it does sit in a lot of other places in Cumbria as well. And local residents are being disadvantaged by tourists, essentially. You know, like much as we love the tourist industry because it brings jobs and money into the county, it's also not doing us very good in a lot of other ways. So I suppose my campaign messages are on housing. We need to be lobbying for changing the law and for changing what houses are built and, you know, like to make them suitable for people that can afford them here. And we also need to be looking at other ways of getting funding in that currently we're not able to get because there's no route legally to actually get that done.
Thank you, Kate. Interesting summary. And please do put things in the chat because we will look at the chat later. So if your point isn't coming up, put it in the chat because that's helpful for us. Okay, group 4. There must be a group 4 somewhere and somebody to speak of from there. Or any of the groups who haven't currently spoken, somebody put your hand up. It was Neil, actually, wasn't it? Neil, you were going to go next.
No, I've already been, actually.
I've been. Okay, because you were in Alistair's group, weren't you?
I was.
So Annette, you put your hand up, didn't you?
Yeah, I was in a group with Chris, so I'm giving the
Okay.
feedback, and Chris is doing some notes. So we were a bit disadvantaged because we couldn't get access between us to the document, so we were kind of like doing it from your remembering your slides, Lorraine. So first off, to say there were no surprises. I think probably we could have written those slides for you, Lorraine. The one that made me think was about the cost of living in a beautiful place. That really did, I think, give us some sort of source of discussion. I have to say that Chris, before we go any further, Chris is responsible for actually keeping the funding and getting the bus going from Penrith to Kendal. So hats off to Chris. Is it the 106? So I think that's worth saying. So yeah, there were no surprises in terms of the feedback. In terms of our kind of campaign message, I don't know if we kind of refined that down, but one of the things I think that we wanted to be noticed was the way that in rural areas you are far less in a position to rely on local and central government services and provision. I mean, I know that's the same for everybody now because they're getting really skinny, aren't they, with their resources. But so therefore, there's much greater reliance on volunteers and voluntary services. And so I think there is a conversation, a message or a campaign around, well, how does that get funded? How does that, at the moment it feels like that's disproportionately funded, but actually rural areas heavily rely on those kinds of services, provision, ability to help. And I suppose the bit that comes back to me is, and Chris and I were talking about the flooding and Storm Arwen, for example. So when you think about those kind of situations where the first response came from, it was from local people and volunteers. So I don't know, Chris, is there anything else that you think?
No, I think that covers what we talked about.
Great,
Yeah.
Thank you both. Very helpful. Very interesting. Next group. Who hasn't spoken? There must be 2 more groups to speak at least. Virginia, go for it. Virginia, you were with Kate, weren't you?
There we are. Oh, I've done it
We can
again.
hear you. We can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so who are we, who's the campaign directed to? Who we're trying to influence? And I think, from where I'm sitting, because I'm, a councillor and I'm on cabinet in Westland and Furness, so it's central government all the way as far as I'm concerned, because only they can really address some of the issues. So, for example, the rural poverty. So I think we mentioned already the sort of indexes of multiple deprivation, which has become the sort of this is what poverty is. But of course, there are other sorts of poverty which don't tick all those boxes. I mean, that's a model very much built on, industrial and post-industrial and urban lives, not rural lives. And so I was Eden before, and those in this, what's it called, the Living Environment Index, Eden was in the bottom 5 percentile of the whole of England, right, absolutely rock bottom, because of the poor housing, because of the poor insulation, and because of being off gas, and and all the rest of it. So there are other kinds of poverty which don't tick the boxes to recognise support, and witness that the government's just taken away the Rural Services Delivery Grant. So that means that though they said that they were going to take the rural funding away and give it to areas to deprivation, well, we've got deprivation, we needed that, and without that 6.4 million, our area is a lot more deprived than it was 5 minutes ago. So there really needs to be consciousness raising with the government, particularly this government, that rural matters, and that they need to understand rural, which they haven't traditionally done. You know, it's not in their playbook. And so I think, sorry, am I talking too much? Can I carry on? Am I talking too much? Sorry.
One little bit more.
Sorry?
One bit more, and then we'll move on.
So, I mean, we, you know, because of this mayor business, you know, we were meeting with Jim McMahon, and, you know, I said, you know, can you reassure me that rural issues matter as much to you as urban and industrial ones? And he didn't answer, just didn't even bother to answer, you know. So, you know, we really do need to make our presence felt, and the reality of rural as being something that is the reality of living in a sort of like in a dysfunctional housing market, which is, you know, where, you know, there are distorting factors in terms of how expensive things are, which aren't produced by our economic circumstances, but produced by the economic circumstances somewhere else. But we're taking the, you know, the sort of like the knock-on of that, which is all those 4 or 5 bedroom houses you're talking about by people, you know, trading in their house in Surrey and coming and living here. And, you know, from my point of view, then becoming a burden on social services in 5 years' time. You know, so I mean, it's really it's a complex economy, and actually, yes. I think economic development is the key to making things happen, and we have to really press this government with its thingy about economic growth. We have to, you know, really push that economic growth means economic growth for everybody, and that we have to find a way to develop highly paid jobs in the, you know, in rural areas as well as in the more obvious post-industrial ones.
That's great, Virginia. I'm going to stop you there.
And I can say a lot about housing.
Yes,
planning, building.
I think your comments about planning in the chat are really helpful, and it's a conversation we're starting to have. So yes, we'll be in touch with you about that.
It's written on my heart. I'll tell you all about it anytime.
Great, no problem. Just a quick reflection. 30 years ago, we had a campaign that said you can't eat the scenery. And that's essentially what you were saying, Virginia. You can't eat the scenery just because you live somewhere lovely. You can't eat it. So economic development is really important, but economic development of a type that suits the rural area rather than the urban model shoved on top of a rural place. So we must have at least one other group who hasn't fed back yet.
Group 4?
Yeah, go for it.
So myself, Simon and Kate were in this group, and Kate has left. And I've put quite a few of the comments in the chat, but essentially I think there wasn't any particular surprises, but we did understand the response around poverty and the fact that we know that it's far more hidden in rural areas, so it doesn't surprise us that quite a lot of the feedback suggested that people didn't know whether it was an issue or not because it presents itself very differently. We had a conversation about how there were some real pockets of deprivation in Cumbria that weren't recognised, and that fuel poverty was a particular issue. Had some discussion around cultural draw for people moving into Cumbria with the right sort of skills to help improve access to services, and that we often market it on being a wonderful place if you want to be outdoors, but that's not necessarily why everybody wants to move somewhere. There needs to be perhaps a bit more consideration and development of things like cultural opportunities and that kind of thing as well to help. What else did we have? Conversations around community resilience and how much harder it is if you don't have the things at home to help you get through poor weather and severe weather and power cuts and things that are often an issue in the area. Simon and I are from a similar spot in the county, so it's nice to compare some notes about Storm Éowyn. And also, yeah, lots of conversations around how difficult it is to get planning and to actually support the development of affordable housing across the county. Simon, was there anything that you think that I've missed? Because I'm conscious that we had a lot of conversation.
No, I think that, yeah, I mean, we also highlighted the bit about buses and public transport and access to that, and that where I live, we've never seen a bus. There's been a bus here in 30 years, I don't think. So there's no transport out here at all, which is an issue. And the medical side, the doctors was the other one we brought up around the problems with getting medical facilities shared out around the rural area and the problems that exists. I mean, we're seeing it at the moment, aren't we, with problems in and around Ullswater and around Coniston and that, where the doctor's surgeries are, going to close down. There'll be nothing there for anybody. And I know Brampton, which is the one I use, they are up against it at the moment, really struggling for staffing. And that, again, is an inherent problem we have right across the county.
Yeah, that is a significant problem. And actually the Third Sector Network and Cumbria CVS are doing quite a lot of work around that. Not necessarily rural focused, but around services for people, health services for people and helping people access that. So that's really positive. So thanks, Simon. Thanks, Josie. So Bridget, has your group fed back? Yep. Becca, has your group fed back? Yep. Anybody else? There must be one more group feedback.
Can I feedback?
Please do, yes.
Right, Sandra. We weren't surprised by the results, disappointed with the lack of knowledge around poverty in your local community, really, because we know there is poverty there. Interesting that there's more stats around child poverty, but that's collected. So there's a lot of other information that's not regularly collected, so it's not as visible and maybe not recognised by people. So perhaps one area of a campaign is actually at a local level, understanding what poverty is in your local community and actually getting communities involved in that discussion. I realise not having a definition might be a barrier, but it's also an opportunity, isn't it, to understand what that means. But then there's that more external audience of understanding what poverty means in Cumbria, whether it's health services across the northeast and North Cumbria or national policy making or wherever that audience is. There's a lack of understanding, and that limitation of roads and mountains. You get some funny ideas that come from London in terms of how you could centralise and make a great service in the middle until they realise the practical reality of the geography. So there's a lot of not understanding it, even from a big perspective. But I actually feel what you need is case studies that are very local community based, that understand the intersectionality of different aspects of poverty, because as it was said in the survey responses, that relationship between economic poverty, but also that access to service and all those limitations, how does that actually play out in a young family's life with their teenagers, etc., etc. If you've got an ill child and they need services across in the northeast and you've got a job to do to pay the rent, etc., how does that really look and feel like? And I think one of the things we spoke about is how media portrays very generalized perceptions that get a sort of sense that that's how people see it, but you need to actually not stick with a generalized perception. You want to know what the reality is for people who live here, and you need a different way to present and show and share that at different levels potentially. We did pick up on active travel, because it is quite irritating when ideas come out to preach and tell you how you should be more active, but actually nobody stood in your community, in your shoes, to see how dangerous that road is to send your child down on their bike between these hours and what have you. And I think in terms of people making decisions about expending limited resources, they've really got to stand in those communities and talk to those communities and say, well, what is going to work here, etc. You haven't had a bus service for 20 years, but what is it that you need to make it possible for you to access a bus service further down the line, or what have you, and to make things join up to support people to be enablers. Housing, we touched on housing as well, but a lot's been said about that, so I'll just pass on that one. I think I've included most of the things, and they've been said elsewhere.
That's great, Sandra. Thank you. Sorry, somebody else? Go on, Penny.
Yes, Agree with that, yeah. I think another thing that we discussed was often assumptions about distances being a problem for accessing services. So someone might say that, oh, your nearest hospital is 10 miles away, but it's 10 miles away the wrong side of a lake and a mountain. It's actually 50 miles away by road. But there might be another one that's 20 miles away by a viable route. Yeah, that sometimes these two issues. And also in terms of transport, road closures, because even if you can drive, if there's only one viable road and it closes and then you've got a 50-mile diversion, I say 50, not 15, that is a big problem in rural areas, particularly with the structure of Cumbria, where you've got a lot of large physical obstacles. So yeah, I think that often isn't taken into account. Just a general lack of understanding of these things from central government, where it's all run from a big city where these issues just don't exist.
Penny, that's so true, and that's partly why we're doing this work, is to actually bring some of those voices to central government so they understand it. And the thought of case studies is really important. We've got over 40 case studies on our website, so do have a look at some of those, because they do actually cover things really well. But poverty is a very difficult one to do case studies on. Who wants to stand up and say, I'm poor? There are some examples in the county. Cumbria CVS have been doing some work in both Barrow and South Lakeland, but it doesn't really cover rural. It's more of it's urban for Cumbria, you know, in the towns. So it's just interesting to think about that. Okay, is any other group that I haven't covered? I'm pretty sure we should have covered you all now, because I've got 7 and I thought there were 7 of you. So we should have covered you all. So thank you very much for that. And we've got a lot of really good stuff in the chat as well. We're not going to solve this evening. I think I said that at the beginning. It was more about airing it, getting your feedback on it. What we do want to do is have you leave with the thought that this conversation needs to continue. If you know groups that this conversation should be had with, then get in touch with us. We can do a 15-minute session or a 1.5 hour session. So if you think there's a group where a 15-minute session on this would be good, let us know. And we'd be very happy to come and have a chat with people and just kind of spread the word. If we're going to put together campaigns on this, the first thing people will say, well, how many people said that? So that's important. So we want to reach a lot of people, but we also then need an evidence base, and ACT is committed to following this up and making sure there's an evidence base behind the things that we end up saying as campaigns. And we want the campaigns to be things that people in communities would say, not the, I don't know, I was going to say the educated upper class, but, you know, not just the paid staff, but the people in a community would actually say about what's important to them. We want to make it those sorts of campaigns as well. So that's really important to us. So we will keep you informed on all of this through our e-news. So hopefully you're all supporters. Put your hand up if you're an ACT supporter. Yeah, excellent. If you're not an ACT supporter, then go onto our website, press the button. It's free. And you get a lovely window sticker for your community building or your home window or whatever works for you. There's a lot of really good resources and comments going in the chat, and we will share that afterwards. We'll summarise it, obviously, but we will share those things. Bridget, you wanted to say something?
It's not related, but I just wanted to highlight that on the 25th of March, CVS is hosting a discussion on devolution. So if I can send you the information, Lorraine, can you send it out, please?
Yes, I'll circulate it to all the people who are here. No problem at all. Yeah. So please do join us if you're not already a supporter. If you already are, thank you very much. And we will keep you informed. This is not the end. This is the beginning of a conversation. Simon, you wanted to add something?
I don't know. I might be barking up the wrong tree completely or whatever else, but I'm just wondering whether it's worth us talking with other areas that are suffering similar issues. So, for instance, what I've listened to here is virtually identical to the situation in Cornwall. They got the same problems. And I'm just wondering whether some discussion with the Cornish, I know they can be a fiery lot, but the Cornish might be worth having a look at, and just to see whether they have come up with any particular plans, because the issues are exactly the same for them as they are for us.
They are,
We're
Simon.
both at opposite ends of the country,
Yeah. Yeah.
as far away from Westminster, and they have the same problems in the case we do.
Absolutely. And so ACT is part of a national network called Action with Communities in Rural England. And so we do talk to Cornwall quite frequently, actually, and a number of other rural areas, because they are similar areas across all of the areas. But actually the way people choose to talk about them are always the same. So we get a lot of national messages about rural poverty, rural housing, rural transport. But what really cuts through in terms of messages and campaigns is local people's voice. So that's why we're doing this, really, is to bring forward those local voices. So I think that's us finished, if that's okay. Thank you very much for your participation. Really, really helpful. Sorry for the IT glitches. There's always going to be some, aren't there? But we will keep you informed, and please think about where we can take this conversation and how we can make it into really useful campaigns that hit national politics as well as local politics to make a difference to some of this. Because I started this by saying these are enduring long-term challenges, and we're not going to sort them out in 5 minutes. But in 5 years, we might actually have some real impact and change some things. So it's worth keeping at it. So thank you very much for your time this evening, and I look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Yeah.